we are going to talk about part 3 of the chapter 7 PowerPoint, which is the sins against faith, hope, and love, as well as the second commandment. So first off, violations of the virtue of faith. Remember, the virtue of faith is a theological virtue. God gives it to us as a gift, and it's helping us to believe more in God. So the opposite of that, of course, would be a refusal to believe in God. And so there's various ways we could do this. We can outright deny a truth of the church. Okay, now some of you have trouble and struggles with some of the church's teachings. That is not necessarily a heresy, because you've also admitted that you don't know enough to really make a full decision about that. So that's very humble and very good of you to recognize that. So St. Augustine put it this way: we should have a faith-seeking understanding. What does that mean? That we should have faith, and if we don't understand something, we should seek that understanding. So don't give up seeking the truth, because if we truly believe that the magisterium and the scriptures are sources of divine revelation, then the truth lies in there. And we need to probe and find out why the church teaches in certain ways. But heresy is this: if after you've done that whole process you say, sorry, I'm going to reject that truth, I just won't agree with it, then you got a problem, because you are rejecting an essential portion of what God is trying to teach us. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You need to accept everything that God is trying to teach us within the church. Second, apostasy. That's when you go a little further, because remember, it gets worse. You totally reject the faith. You leave the faith. You have nothing to do with Jesus or God anymore. And you can understand maybe sometimes a baptized Christian might willingly leave the church. Maybe it's because they don't care anymore. Maybe it's because they got wrapped up in an addiction or something pleasurable in the world and they just let it go. Now, of course, the amount of culpability we have for that is up to God. We can't judge people ourselves, but we need to make sure that in our faith we never do that. The last one is kind of rare, but this is more for theologians and philosophers who doctrinally try to start their own religion. In history, there's been various ones like Martin Luther, John Calvin. Earlier in history, Arius, who was a bishop who started a whole heresy and then got a bunch of people to follow him. Refusal to remain in union with the Pope. And you go off and you start your own version of your faith and bring a bunch of followers with you. You can see how that's worse, because you're leading other people astray. Now, hope is, again, trusting in God. We talked a lot about trusting in God. So ways to violate that virtue are twofold, one or the other. It's despair on one end, which means that you lose hope in God, and you try to turn to other things, like yourself or pleasures of the world or whatever, to escape from your problems rather than trusting in God. Or the opposite extreme is kind of narcissism, where you presume that you can do it all, that you can make everything happen for yourself. Another way of putting this is self-reliance. There's a sin of self-reliance, that you can handle everything. You don't need God. These go right to the core of that original sin. Remember? Adam and Eve in the garden, and Satan tempted them, and they decided that they didn't need God to get what they wanted. They couldn't trust him, so they're going to do it on their own terms. Those are sins against the virtue of hope. Now, for charity or love, which is a gift to the Holy Spirit as well as a theological virtue, I want you to read 1 Corinthians 13. That's the famous passage of love you're going to see in all the weddings and everything like that. And I want you to think about, why is love the greatest of all the virtues? There are 2 reasons for this. Now, I'm going to come back next week in another video, and I'm going to talk about this. But I want you to think about it over this week. Why is love the greatest of the virtues? And we're going to have a little bit of a classroom discussion on that after everybody reads the passage. All right, some other things that is interesting to talk about. I'm not going to talk about them all, but typical things that come up in classroom discussions. We know about idolatry, but superstition, divination, and black magic. Okay, why are those so bad? Well, first of all, you're not trusting in God. If you look to palm reading or the stars or tarot cards or anything like that to predict your future, you're not trusting in God for your future. There's also something else that you're doing, which is opening up a little hole into your soul where evil influences can affect you. So if I were you, I'd stay away from all of those things. Ouija boards, tarot cards, consulting with crystal balls, anything like that. Because it will affect you negatively. I would even not watch movies or TV shows where there's pentagrams and satanic influences. I would not do that because it will affect you. Now, sacrilege. We had a little incident, I think we talked about it a couple weeks ago, where some students took the Eucharist and they put it in a trashy locker and were mocking it. That is sacrilege. When you take anything that's sacramental and you mock it and you treat it in a profane way. I think we know what atheism and agnosticism are. Simony, the buying or selling of spiritual goods, that is if you allude or promise that if somebody donates money to the church, then they're going to heaven. And we have to be very careful that as a church we don't do that. We don't promise people spiritual goods for their money. That is simony. In the second commandment, this is one having to do with our language. Proverbs says the tongue is like a double-edged sword. So, using the Lord's name in vain. His name is holy, holy, holy. So when people say OMG or, GD or anything like that, you have to be really careful because you're taking the holiest name and you're using it in a profane way. Blasphemy is when you speak out against Jesus, God, the church, anybody in a profane way. Just like sacrilege is treating something in a profane way, blasphemy is speaking in a profane way about holy things. And then there's swearing, which is using God's name frivolously. I just gave you a couple examples of that. Obscenity, which is different from vulgarity. I'm going to make an example here. So it could be the same words. You know the words I'm talking about. The F word, the S word, the B word, the G word, and all the other words that start with something, okay, that you don't want to say. And obscenity is when you intend to hurt somebody with those words. When you're angry and you use those words in anger towards somebody. You can see how that's worse than just using them in casual conversation. Well, at this point, usually a student raises my hand and says, Mr. Stitzius, is it a sin to curse? Well, here's my answer to that. Definitely it's sinful if you're using curse words in anger against somebody because you're not loving them. Remember, sin is not love. What about if you're just joking around with your friends and you're just using the F word or the S word in casual conversation? Is that sinful? Well, what do you think? Are you truly loving yourself and others and God by using that tasteless, coarse language? Think of the words themselves and what they actually stand for. Each one of these curse words is a profane way of talking about a biological function of the human body. And God made our bodies good, and yet you're talking about it in a vulgar way. So, is it unloving? I think so. Now, there might be cases where you're not culpable. If you are running on the field and playing in a game and your leg gets broken in two places and you let an obscenity go, I think God will understand. That's maybe not even conscious. You're just doing it. And you're not as culpable as if you were just doing it all the time. So, think about that. Hopefully that your language will improve and that you will try to speak holy words all the time.